I've made videos here before about unfair dismissal cases and circumstances where the employers end up losing quite a bit of money at a WRC hearing, a Workplace Relations Commission hearing, for unfair dismissal. The case that I'm going to talk about now involves the employee winning €42,000 from the employer for unfair dismissal. There's two features though of the case that I want to just focus on or explain. One is that the unfair dismissal claim against the employer, which cost €42,000, was almost certainly entirely avoidable by the employer if he had taken advice in advance or gone about the termination in a different way. The second unusual feature of the case is the employer's policy of never giving a written reference, and the adjudicator finding as a consequence that this policy of never giving a written reference contributed to the employee's losses and was taken into account in calculating the financial loss when the employee won the case. So the employer apparently had a policy of only giving oral or verbal references and offered, I think, to give his mobile phone number to Mr. D'Amato for anyone perhaps to make inquiries or look for a reference. But his policy was not to give a written reference, and as I said, the unusual feature here is simply that the adjudicator held that that was a contributory factor in the losses that accrued to Mr. D'Amato, the employee. Let's take a look though at the particulars of the case. The salesman, his name was Graziano D'Amato. He was awarded €42,000 by the WRC. His employer, Trip Admit Limited, dismissed him, and he brought a claim under the Unfair Dismissals Act 1977. The company's chief executive said it was his policy not to give references in writing. The chief executive of Trip Admit, Mr. Maguire, he said that they opened for business in 2019, and this was just 11 months before the COVID-19 pandemic hit, and the firm was still relying heavily on investment fundraising to stay in business. He said that due to a combination of a lack of funding and investment, it had decided to reduce headcount, and it did reduce headcount from 14 to 7, with Mr. D'Amato the first to go. It had been made clear to Mr. D'Amato that he was stepping into a difficult role with aggressive sales targets when he joined the firm in September 2021. He didn't meet the targets according to Mr. Maguire. He only ever achieved 46% of his target over the period, and he only achieved the target once in 19 months. So Mr. Maguire obviously had a problem with Mr. D'Amato's performance, and he basically said that he was far below anything that we required. Mr. Maguire pointed out, gave evidence that they're a loss-making company. They couldn't sustain the losses indefinitely. And the termination reason then, as per the notice of termination, could have been worded better. Basically, Mr. Maguire communicated that his performance, Mr. D'Amato's performance, needed to improve. Mr. D'Amato's evidence, however, was that the line manager didn't say anything about sales performance. The customers using the Trip Admit software were not generating enough revenue. That's the wording in the letter. That's the essential point in all this, according to Mr. D'Amato. He's telling me the customers aren't making money. It's not because it's not hitting the target. So that was the basis of Mr. D'Amato's claim for unfair dismissal. And the termination letter said, unfortunately, we have to let you go because the performance of your customers, they're not what we want. So clearly, that doesn't amount to substantial grounds, quite frankly, under the unfair dismissals legislation. Mr. D'Amato made the point that he was never given any warning in any shape or form, and he considered himself to be professional and a good English speaker, etc., etc., and he would have understood if, you know, he received a formal warning or anything of that nature as to performance, but he didn't. Mr. D'Amato then produced a document and said, you know, that Mr. D'Amato made a point about the shortage of funding claimed by Mr. Maguire, and basically said he was going to America twice and to trade shows and so on, and that's not the sort of thing that you'd be doing if you were short of finance. Mr. Maguire countered that by saying we fly as cheap as we can and we stay as cheap as we can, and we need to do that to grow our business. It's not as if we're going to Las Vegas and you know, staying in five-star hotels and having a ball. So there was an argy-bargy there, or a conflict of evidence about the financing or the lack of financing that Mr. Maguire claimed gave rise to these terminations. Mr. D'Amato then, when he was calculating his financial losses from his dismissal, said he was out of work because his employer, or he was out of work for so long because his employer will not give him a written reference. Mr. Maguire said that it was really, really difficult to find salespeople of Mr. D'Amato's level in Ireland, and said, I would question how hard it is to actually find a sales job. So Mr. Maguire said Mr. D'Amato didn't make enough effort, quite frankly, to mitigate his loss and get a new sales job. And he said as well, he said, as a matter of policy, I do not provide any employees with a written reference, and have never done so in my entire career. I have stated that I would always be on hand to provide a verbal reference if asked. And Mr. D'Amato has my mobile number. So the adjudicator found that there was probably a lawful route open to Trip Admit to terminate Mr. D'Amato, and that lawful route would have been by reason of redundancy. They reduced the sales or the headcount from 14 to 7, so clearly there was redundancies there, and it would probably have been easy enough to justify a redundancy if the sales figures weren't up to scratch and so on, and if the company was struggling and if finance was an issue, then redundancy would be something that an employer would have to consider. And redundancy is a defence to an unfair dismissal claim. So that's the route Mr. Maguire could have gone down. Instead, he went down the route of telling Mr. D'Amato that the clients he was getting weren't spending enough money. The termination letter had failed to identify whether it was the performance of the business that was at issue, or because Mr. D'Amato was failing to perform his duties properly. So the termination letter wasn't actually specific or clear as to the reason for the termination. And remember, for a dismissal to be a fair dismissal, there must be substantial grounds for the dismissal. The letter, according to the adjudicator, appears to suggest that the complainant was being let go due to his client base not being economic, but that this was also an issue related to his performance somehow. So that was the observation made by the adjudicator, Mr. Murphy. He said there was neither any mention of redundancy nor any written evidence of the company having raised performance issues with Mr. D'Amato, the adjudicator held. The adjudicator said that the company was still not entirely clear about the grounds that they seek to rely on at the point of the case coming up for hearing. In other words, precisely why did the termination occur? Was it performance? Was it the clients or the customers' failure to spend enough money, or was it something else? In the circumstances, the adjudicator said the respondent, the employer, has failed to demonstrate substantial grounds justifying the dismissal, and the claim must succeed, he wrote. The adjudicator found also that the company, the employer, contributed to Mr. D'Amato's loss of earnings by refusing to provide a written reference without any justification. He said it would be unreasonable to presume that Mr. D'Amato's ongoing loss of earnings would continue for a full 2 years, which is the upper limit of the claim for unfair dismissal. And he awarded Mr. D'Amato 1 year's salary. Mr. D'Amato was awarded €42,000 for his losses. And remember, if the employer went about this in the correct way and perhaps went through a redundancy process, then it wouldn't have been nearly as expensive, because redundancy is a defence to an unfair dismissal claim, and provided you go through proper redundancy procedure, that's going to be a successful defence to any claim for unfair dismissal. The other thing is that Mr. D'Amato didn't have, I don't believe, in excess of 2 years service, and therefore a redundancy situation wouldn't have given rise to any redundancy payment due to Mr. D'Amato. So Mr. Maguire and Trip Admit, or his company, could have avoided, Mr. Maguire could have avoided this unfair dismissal claim if he had gone about the termination in a different way. And obviously that's what the adjudicator was saying there as well, that there appeared to be a lawful way for Mr. Maguire to terminate the employment, but that didn't happen. Hope you find the video useful. If you do, I'd appreciate it if you hit the thumbs up button down below, and you may be interested in subscribing to my YouTube channel. Thank you very much.